And Amy, how poorly will history treat President Obama and John Kerry and Benghazi Sue? How do you do now? You gonna die if you're in Syria, because they didn't get all of Assad's chemical weapons caches, and they lied when they said it. Both President Obama and his national security advisor.
Just think about what we've done these last 8 years without firing a shot. We've eliminated Syria's declared chemical weapons program. All of these steps have helped keep us safe and helped keep our troops safe. Those are the result of diplomacy. We don't have strong efforts there, the more you will be called upon to clean up after the failure of diplomacy.
We were able to find a solution that actually removed the chemical weapons that were known from Syria in a way that the use of force would never have accomplished.
Except that's not what happened. And New York Times piece yesterday, former Assistant Secretary of State during the Obama administration concedes they knew they didn't get all the chemical weapons. But President Obama and Susan Rice lied about it anyway. How poorly will history treat President Obama and his team for lying? Richard Haass from the Council on Foreign Relations.
Well, there was a lot of frustration. There was a sense that the Obama presidency was a bit of paralysis by analysis. And in some ways, it was such a tight center. It was the president, Ben Rhodes, and a few others who then afterwards tried to make the case that what they did was a solution to the chemical problem in Syria when everybody knows it wasn't. No, history is going to be rough on this. This is going to be the defining moment for the Obama presidency. And what is so interesting about it, it's going to be a moment of inaction. And it proves the point that what you don't do can matter every bit as much as what you do when you govern.
Well, let's get some more expert analysis on the topic. And to do that, we're pleased to be joined by our friend, Colonel Ralph Peters, retired U.S. Army officer and a strategic analyst for Fox News Channel, of course. Colonel Peters, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Always glad to speak with you.
And so do you agree with Mr. Haass about how history will treat President Obama and his team for what we now know to be true about the reality on the ground in Syria?
Well, I think history is going to be tough on Obama's foreign policy overall. I mean, it was just one disaster by neglect after another. When he did take an action, it was a negative action, such as pulling our troops out of Iraq precipitously and prematurely. I mean, partisanship aside, any objective person would look at the foreign policy of the Obama presidency and judge it as virtually a complete failure. Certainly when it came to threats such as military threats, instability in the Middle East, dealing with terrorism. So history will judge him harshly. However, I do warn people that while, looking back at Obama, he was so pathetic, and Susan Rice and Tony Blinken and a whole bunch, it's easy to gloat and kind of revel in their incompetence. That doesn't help us today.
Right.
Just be glad they are gone. They're done. It's over. It's a new regime. It's a new leadership set now, and what we need to concentrate on is where we are and where we're going. And I obviously last week President Trump encouraged me by his decisive action, and decisive and yet measured. I mean, he clearly was listening to Jim Mattis, to H.R. McMaster, and learning. And I've had some concerns about President Trump because of his inexperience and the ties to Russia, which are indisputable on the part of his campaign staff. But people grow into their jobs, and it seems to me that, and I'm speaking specifically of foreign policy and security now, it seems that President Trump is showing good instincts in who he's appointed, who he's listening to. And it's interesting to watch from Washington, where I'm based. You watch the ballet, or sometimes it's just a square dance or even a riot. But the notable thing is, when you had this attack last week, you didn't have General Mattis, our Secretary of Defense, or the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, jumping out in front of cameras saying, "Hey, look at me, I'm wonderful, I did this." They're glad to stay in the background. They're military people. They're not hogging the limelight. They're letting President Trump, have the attention, and he does clearly thrive on that. So I think we're seeing a maturation of the administration. Certainly, again, on foreign policy. And there's also sometimes people who can help you get elected aren't necessarily the people who can help you govern effectively. And what we've seen was the more rabble-rousing elements from Trump's campaign pushed the president into premature executive orders, into pushing for a health care reform that wasn't ready. It wasn't ready to go. It wasn't ready to drive off the lot. And so those people, the radical ideologues, led to one embarrassment after another for the president, where the quiet professional military people gave him a clear win. I mean, last week...
Well, Gorsuch was a clear win.
Excuse me?
Gorsuch was a clear win.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's absolutely correct. And Gorsuch is not one of the screaming rabble-rousers. He's a good, solid, dependable jurist. And Democrats, I couldn't believe they opposed this guy. This guy was clearly as good as they could hope for in this administration. He's a serious jurist. But at any rate, last week we saw a fascinating change, whereas the global elites, of course, have been utterly opposed to Trump all along. And last week, when President Trump responded promptly and clearly to the Russian-backed use of poison gas by the Syrian regime, you had Europeans cheering for Donald Trump, saying, go get him. In fact, the British want us to do more. And so I think, when you, on a practical level, that's good. You want allies, but also it's good because President Trump thrives on positive reinforcement. And the fact that the people who just a day before had been criticizing him horribly suddenly were saying, go get him, big boy, I think that resonates with him very strongly.
So later this afternoon, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is on his way to Russia. Do you think there should be a window where Putin can stop backing Assad? Should that be offered up for part of the conversation?
Well, with Putin, you have to take a firm stand. But I would say what really matters is what's said behind closed doors. Because if you take a public stand and give Putin an ultimatum, hey, you got to get out of Syria by the 4th of July, that doesn't work. Because he's got to worry about his domestic image. He thrives on the fact that he's got a strong man image. What the Russians call a nastoyashi muzhik, a real tough guy, a real man. And so we have to be firm with Russia, but there's no need to be dramatic and be grandstanding about it. It's much more effective if you are quietly firm. Now, we did have a mini setback yesterday in Lucca at the G7 meeting, where the Europeans could not agree on additional sanctions on Russia because of the Syria action. It's primarily because Italy and the other South European countries, their economies are struggling, and the sanctions cost them too. But the good news in this that people are missing is earlier there had been calls from various European countries to weaken or eliminate the sanctions, and that's now off the table. They were all for keeping the sanctions we've got. So in a way, that was progress. But this is a real test for Secretary of State Tillerson. I mean, he's now up against Sergei Lavrov, who's a survivor. He's been around a long time. He's a good negotiator, and he's not afraid to lie outright. And we have trouble with that. I mean, we Americans, we want to believe that people are being honest with us, look into Putin's eyes and see his soul, blah, blah. But the Russians, when they're negotiating, they will lie, and they'll lie, and they'll lie with a straight face. They'll look you in the eyes. And I've dealt with them. I've dealt with the Russians in Moscow. I've dealt with the security services, and they are masterful liars. And so you got to really pin them down. For instance, a classic example is the Obama administration's nutty decision to trust Russian assurances that Syria would get rid of all its chemical weapons. I mean, that's, if you don't have anybody on the ground verifying, you're nuts to trust the Russians. It just doesn't work.
Well, to this point then, and your talk of your position that saber rattling is not helpful in terms of advancing the flag against Putin, then what of all the talk of regime change from Rexon and Spicer and Nikki Haley? Is that helpful? Is that even a moral and national security imperative to have regime change in Syria, given what may replace that regime?
Well, I think let me turn this around on you. It won't happen this week or month, But I think there's a chance that the Russians are going to see Assad himself as a liability. What the Russians want are their bases, the Tartus naval base, now
Right.
the new air base, maybe 2 air bases. They want influence in Syria. They want Syria in their camp. Whether it's Assad or not doesn't matter. So I would not be surprised if in the coming few months we see an internal palace coup, tacitly supported by the Russians, to get rid of Assad but replace him with somebody else of the same ilk, but who could negotiate, who could be seen as a figure to negotiate the future of Syria.
Wouldn't the Iranians have to sign off on that too?
Yeah, and I think the Iranians might well sign off on it, but and eventually we'll see conflict between the Russians and the Iranians. But right now they are unified by their relative success, and they're unified by their hatred of America. And you ask if it was if it was a national or security imperative to get rid of Assad. Is it an imperative? No. Would it be useful if somebody got rid of Assad? It certainly would. And should we worry about what might come after Assad? Oh, yes, of course. But when a dictator is responsible for the death of 500,000 of his own people,
Mm-hmm.
I don't really think that's somebody we can do serious business with. And right now, we are on the losing end in Syria totally. Were it up to me, I mean, all this nonsense about Putin saying, we need to unite in the war against terrorism. In Syria right now, we are fighting the terrorists. The Russians are fighting the Syrian rebels who we've been armed and who we've backed. I mean, we're patsies. We are doing the dirty work for Iran and the Russians and the Syrians by fighting ISIS. They're not fighting ISIS. They're not lifting hardly a finger. We're doing all the tough stuff out around Raqqa while they're massacring the good guys and bombing men, women, and children. And Putin would love us to agree to this. We'll have a coalition against ISIS because that gives him a free hand and we still do the dirty work. What I would do personally right now, I would stop all U.S. Military operations in Syria. I'd concentrate on Iraq. I'd tell Putin, you want to fight terrorism? Hey, here's your chance, big boy. Go get them. ISIS in Syria is now your responsibility. Now, we're not going to do that. We're not going to walk away from our Kurdish allies. But all this nonsense and nuttiness I hear from the extreme right, where Putin's a good guy and Putin should be our ally. Putin hates the United States of America. He works against our interests. He's got this visceral hatred of the United States. And the idea that he is going to be our ally in a civilizational struggle against Islam is just sheer wackiness. We need to, our allies are Australia, Britain, yes, France, Germany, Canada. Putin is not even part of our civilization. This guy is an Asiatic monster.
Yeah, I mean, I think most conservatives agree with that description of Putin. He is Colonel Ralph Peters, retired U.S. Army officer and, of course, strategic analyst for Fox News Channel. Colonel Peters, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.